Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, where a man's hope can build a home in the middle of nowhere, and where the horizon, which promises a new dawn, can just as easily deliver an army of ghosts from the past. Pour yourself a coffee, friend, for this is a story about the morning of a wedding, the quiet joy of a man who has finally found his peace, and the terrible, earth-shaking shadow that came to test whether that peace was a foundation of rock or merely a dream built on dust. The silence was the first thing a man noticed, and the last thing he ever took for granted. Out here, in the vast, rolling grasslands of the Dakota Territory, silence wasn't an absence of noise. It was a presence. It was in the endless, sighing whisper of the prairie grass, a sound like a distant ocean. It was in the high, lonely cry of a red-tailed hawk circling in a sky so impossibly blue it hurt the eyes. It was in the soft, rhythmic creak of the porch swing Elias Thorne had finished just last week, a sound that spoke of a future filled with quiet, shared evenings. For Elias, a man who had spent the better part of his 40 years surrounded by the noise of violence, this silence was the most precious thing he owned. It was the foundation of the new life he had built with his own two hands, a life he had carved out of this wild and tamed land, one nail, one fence post, one prayer at a time. His ranch, if one could call it that, was modest. A small, sturdy cabin built from pine logs he had hauled down from the Black Hills himself, the joints so perfectly notched that the wind couldn't find a way to whistle through them. A strong, well-kept barn that housed his two steady horses and a milk cow. A corral with fences that were straight and true. And 100 acres of the finest grazing land this side of the Missouri, a sea of grass that rippled and flowed all the way to the hazy, distant horizon. He had named the place Anna's Hope. It was the only name that had ever felt right. This morning, the last morning of his life as a solitary man, the silence was filled with a low, happy hum. Elias was preparing for his wedding. He moved through the small cabin with a deliberate, gentle purpose that would have surprised any man who had known him 10 years prior. The hands that had once been so adept at the cold, efficient mechanics of a cold peacemaker were now surprisingly tender as they adjusted the new calico curtains on the window soft, cornflower blue, just like she'd described in her last letter. He ran a calloused palm over the surface of the small dining table he had spent a month sanding until it was as smooth as river-polished stone. He checked the larder, stocked with flour, coffee, and tins of peaches, a luxury he had ridden 2 days to the town of Deadwood to procure. Everything had to be perfect. Anna was arriving tomorrow. Her name was a constant, warm presence in his mind. Anna Mayhew, a schoolteacher from St. Louis, a woman he had never met in the flesh, yet knew better than he knew his own soul. Their courtship had been a thing of paper and ink, a slow, careful construction of trust and affection built over a year of letters that traveled the long and certain miles by train and stagecoach. He had first written to her through a matrimonial correspondence notice in a newspaper, a desperate act for a man who had long resigned himself to a life alone. His first letter had been short, blunt, and honest. He described his land, his past as a man who had seen too much of the wrong side of things, and his simple, profound desire for a partner, for a quiet life, for a reason to watch the sunrise. He had not expected a reply, but she had written back. Her letters were filled with a wit, an intelligence, and a deep, abiding kindness that had cracked open a part of his heart he had thought long dead and fossilized. She wrote of her love for books, her frustration with city life, and her own dream of a life with purpose under a wide, open sky. They had traded truths and dreams across the vast, empty spaces, and in doing so, had built a bridge of words that was stronger than any physical bond. He had sent her a photograph of himself, a grim and smiling man with a weathered face and eyes that held the shadows of a hard life. She had sent one back, a woman with a kind, intelligent face, a warm, gentle smile, and eyes that seemed to see right through the grim facade to the hopeful man beneath. 6 months ago, he had asked her to be his wife. A month ago, her letter of acceptance had arrived, and the world had shifted on its axis. He walked into the small bedroom, the room that would soon be theirs. On the bed, laid out with the care of a museum curator, was his wedding suit. It was a simple, dark broadcloth suit, the finest thing he had ever owned. Beside it was a new white shirt, ironed so smooth it shined, and a string tie. He touched the sleeve of the coat, the fabric still stiff and new. This was the uniform of his new life, The skin of the man he was becoming, Elias Thorne, the husband. He turned and looked at his reflection in the small, wavy mirror he had hung on the wall. The face that stared back was a stranger's. The hard lines around his mouth seemed softer. The weary, haunted look in his eyes, a permanent fixture from his years as a scout for the army and later, as a man who rode with a badge in territories where the law was little more than a suggestion, was gone. In its place was a quiet, nervous joy, a look of such profound, unadulterated hope that it almost frightened him. He was not just leaving his old life behind, he was becoming a new man entirely. Over the mantel in the main room hung the only relic of that old life, a long, heavy Sharps rifle, its wood stock dark and smooth from use, its barrel a dull, deadly gray. It was a tool of his former trade, a thing of violence and death. He had not fired it in the 2 years since he had staked his claim on this land. It hung there now as a reminder, a silent testament to the man he no longer wished to be. He had built his peace, and the rifle was a sleeping wolf, a guardian he prayed he would never have to wake. As the afternoon sun slanted low, casting long, golden fingers of light across the prairie, Elias took a chair out onto the porch. He pulled a small, worn bundle of letters from his shirt pocket, the edges of the envelope soft and frayed from countless readings. He selected the most recent one from Anna. "My dearest Elias," the letter began, her handwriting a neat, elegant script. "The stagecoach ticket is purchased, and my bags are nearly packed. It is with a heart full of both trepidation and a joy so profound it frightens me that I write this. To think that in just a few short weeks, the face I have come to know only through your honest, heartfelt words will be standing before me. It feels like a dream I am afraid to wake from. Do not worry about the grandeur of the house, my love. A home is not made of wood and nails, but of the life that is lived within it. Your descriptions of the silence, the vastness of the sky, and the land you have named in my honor, that is all the grandeur I will ever need. I am not coming to a ranch, Elias. I am coming home. I will be on the westward stage arriving in Deadwood on the 15th. Be patient with my tired eyes and dusty dress. And be ready, my dear, dear Elias, to begin our life. Yours, with all my heart, Anna." The 15th. That was tomorrow. The stage would arrive in the afternoon. He would ride out in the morning to meet her. They would be married by the traveling preacher in Deadwood and would return here, to Anna's hope, to begin their life. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in his pocket, tucking it away like a sacred relic. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. He looked out at the vast, peaceful prairie, now bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the setting sun. The world was awash in hues of gold, rose, and a deep, tranquil purple. A profound sense of peace settled over him, a feeling of rightness, of destiny fulfilled. He had fought his wars. He had buried his ghosts. He had earned this stillness. He sat there until the last of the light had faded and the sky was a blanket of diamond dust stars. The silence of the prairie wrapped around him, a comforting, helpful embrace. He thought of Anna, of her smile, of the future that was so close he could almost taste it. It was the last perfect, peaceful night of his life. He went to bed a man whose dreams were on the verge of becoming real, blissfully unaware that the horizon he stared at with such hope was, at that very moment, giving birth to a nightmare. Elias awoke before the dawn, as was his habit. But this morning was different. He did not wake to the familiar, internal clock of a rancher with chores to be done. He awoke with a jolt, a sense of buoyant, nervous energy that had been foreign to him for decades. It was the feeling a child has on Christmas morning, a thrilling, heart-thumping anticipation. Today was the day. Today, he would meet Anna. He rose from his bed and, in the pre-dawn gloom of the cabin, moved with a quiet, happy purpose. He lit a small fire in the hearth, not for warmth, but for the cheerful, crackling sound of it. He put a pot of coffee on to brew, the rich, dark aroma filling the small space. Today was a day for celebration, a day for the good coffee. As the first, pale, pearlescent light of dawn began to creep over the eastern horizon, he took his steaming mug of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. He wanted to watch the sunrise. He wanted to witness the birth of the most important day of his life. The world was still and silent, bathed in a soft, gray light. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the sweet, clean scent of the prairie grass. A low-lying mist clung to the hollows, making the world seem ethereal and new, a blank canvas upon which his future would be painted. He took a deep, satisfying breath, the coffee warming his hands, a feeling of profound, perfect contentment settling in his soul. This was his home. This was his future. He sat on the porch swing, the gentle, rhythmic creak the only sound in the world. He watched as the gray light in the east began to bleed into a soft, rose-colored blush. The sun was coming. Anna was coming. Everything was right. And then, it wasn't. It was a change so subtle at first that a lesser man, a man not as attuned to the subtle rhythms of the wild, would have missed it entirely. The birds, which had just begun their cheerful morning chorus, fell silent. All of them. All at once. The silence they left behind was not the peaceful, living silence he cherished. It was a dead, heavy, and natural quiet. Elias stopped swinging. He sat perfectly still, his coffee mug held halfway to his lips, his senses, honed by years of surviving in hostile territory, suddenly on high alert. His eyes scanned the vast, empty horizon. The skin on the back of his neck prickled. Something was wrong. The land was holding its breath. He stood up, his body moving with an old, familiar tension he had thought he'd left behind. He set the coffee mug down on the porch rail, his eyes never leaving the eastern horizon. He could feel it now, more than see it. A faint, low-frequency vibration in the soles of his boots, a tremor so slight it was more a feeling than a physical sensation. It was the feeling of the earth itself bracing for an impact. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a dark line on the horizon, a smudge against the brightening, rose-colored sky, so faint he thought it might be a trick of the low light, a bank of distant clouds. But it was not a cloud. Clouds drift. This line was moving, advancing, growing. It was moving with a single, unified purpose. It was not a herd of buffalo. He had seen the great herds, and they were a chaotic, rolling tide of black. This was different. This was organized. This was disciplined. As the line drew closer, as the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting its first golden rays across the prairie, the line resolved itself into individual shapes. Riders. Hundreds of them. They were spread out in a long, impossibly wide crescent, a silent, implacable wave of men and horses, so numerous they seemed to fill the entire horizon. Elias's blood ran cold. The warmth of the coffee, the joy of the morning, the hope for his future had all evaporated, replaced by a deep, visceral, ice-cold dread. These were not settlers. They were not soldiers. He could see the glint of the rising sun on the tips of lances, the dark, stark lines of war paint on the faces that were now becoming visible, the eagle feathers that adorned the war bonnets of the chiefs who rode at the head of the formation. They were warriors. Sioux, Cheyenne or Arapaho, by the look of their dress and markings. A unified host, a gathering of the tribes the likes of which had not been seen in a generation. And there were not just 100 or 200. He did a quick, practiced, terrifying calculation. There were at least 500 of them. A war party of a size that could wipe a small town from the face of the earth. An army. They did not ride fast. They advanced at a slow, deliberate, funereal pace, their horses walking in a steady, synchronized rhythm. They made no sound. No war cries, no whooping, no drumming. There was only the low, growing rumble of thousands of hoofbeats, a sound that was becoming a physical pressure in the air, a deep, resonant thunder that was the antithesis of the silence Elias had cherished. They were a force of nature, a gathering of ghosts from the land's long and bloody past, risen to reclaim their world. And they were marching directly towards his home, towards Anna's hope. The dream of the future, so bright and beautiful just moments before, shattered into a million pieces. The man he had tried to become, the gentle, hopeful husband, evaporated in the face of this overwhelming, terrifying reality. The man who was left was the one he thought he had buried, Elias Thorne, the scout, the survivor, the killer. His past, which he had run from for so long, had not just caught up with him. It had come to his very doorstep, 500 strong, to burn his future to the ground. He stood frozen on his porch, a solitary, insignificant figure against the backdrop of his small, hopeful cabin. The vast, silent army of warriors advanced, their shadow falling over the sun-drenched prairie, a creeping, inexorable darkness that was coming to swallow his world whole. The coffee mug on the porch rail, forgotten, vibrated from the thunder of the hooves tipped, and fell to the wooden planks with a sharp, shattering crash that was lost in the growing roar of the apocalypse. The shattering of the coffee mug was the sound that broke Elias's paralysis. It was a small, domestic sound, a sound from the life he had been building, and it was utterly, obscenely out of place in the face of the approaching army. The two realities, his dream and his nightmare, collided in that single, sharp report, and the man who had been frozen in disbelief was replaced by the man who had survived a dozen impossible situations. His mind, which had been filled with thoughts of Anna and a wedding, was now a cold, clear, calculating machine. He did not panic. Panic was a luxury a man in his position could not afford. He backed away from the edge of the porch, moving into the shadows of the cabin, his eyes never leaving the advancing line of warriors. They were closer now, close enough for him to see the grim, determined set of their jaws, the cold, hard light in their eyes. This was not a raid for horses or supplies. This was a statement. It was a claiming of the land, a deliberate, unstoppable act of war. His mind worked with a lightning speed he had not called upon in years, a detached, tactical analysis that was as much a part of him as the scars on his knuckles. The numbers, 500, perhaps more. An insurmountable, impossible number for one man. The terrain, open grassland. No cover. No defensible positions. His cabin, so sturdy against the wind and snow, was a tinderbox, a coffin of logs that would offer no protection against a concerted attack. The weapons, he had the Sharps rifle over the mantel, a powerful, long-range weapon. He had his old Colt Peacemaker, holstered on a gun belt hanging by the door, and he had a small, double-barreled shotgun for hunting birds. He had perhaps 100 rounds for the rifle, 50 for the pistol. It was an arsenal that might hold off a small band of outlaws for an hour. Against this army, it was a pittance, a handful of pebbles to be thrown against a tidal wave. The conclusion of his cold, brutal calculus was as clear and stark as the morning light. To stay was to die. There was no victory to be had here. No glorious last stand. There would only be a brief, violent, and utterly insignificant death. The choice, then, should have been simple. Flee. His survival instincts, the ones that had kept him alive in ambushes in the Apache territories and in gunfights in lawless Kansas towns, screamed at him to run. His horse, a fast, strong gelding named Shadow, was in the barn. He could be saddled in under a minute. He could slip out the back, use the shallow ravine behind the barn for cover, and be a mile away before the warriors even reached his cabin. They were on foot, their horses being led. He had the advantage of speed. He could ride west, hard and fast, and not look back. He could survive. He could meet Anna's stagecoach in Deadwood, tell her what had happened, and they could go somewhere else. California, the Oregon Valley, somewhere, anywhere but here. He could live. He turned and took a step towards the door, his mind already mapping the escape route, his body ready to spring into that familiar, desperate action of flight. But then he stopped. His eyes fell on the cornflower blue curtains hanging in the window. He saw the smooth, polished surface of the dining table. He saw the small, framed photograph of Anna on the mantel, her kind, smiling face a beacon of a life he had so desperately wanted. To run would be to abandon all of it. Not just the physical objects, the cabin and the barn he had built with his own sweat and blood, but the idea, the dream, the very man he had become in this place. If he ran, he would be reverting to the man he had been before, the solitary, haunted drifter, a man whose only home was the back of his horse, whose only future was the next dusty horizon. He would be killing the man Anna had fallen in love with, the man who had built a home and dared to hope. He would survive, yes, but what part of him would truly be left alive? He would be a walking ghost, forever haunted by the memory of the morning he had chosen his own life over his own soul. He was standing at a crossroads. One path led to physical survival, a long, empty life of running. The other path led to certain death, but it was a death in defense of everything he had come to hold sacred, his home, his honor, his love for a woman he had not yet met. He walked to the mantel, his movements slow and deliberate, as if in a dream. He looked at Anna's photograph, at her smiling, hopeful eyes. What would she want him to do? She was a woman of courage and conviction. She would not want a coward. She would not want a man who had abandoned the very dream they had built together. She would want the man who had written to her of his desire for a quiet, honorable life, a man who was willing to stand for something. The choice became clear. It was a terrible, illogical, and utterly necessary choice. He reached up and took the heavy Sharps rifle down from its pegs. The feel of the cold, familiar steel in his hands was like a jolt of electricity. The weight of it was a burden, but it was also a comfort. It was the tool of his old life, but he would now use it in the service of his new one. He checked the action, the smooth, well-oiled click, a sound of deadly finality. He walked to the peg by the door and buckled on his gun belt, settling the familiar weight of the Colt on his hip. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the hopeful rancher. He was a warrior, preparing to defend his own small, sovereign nation of one. He did not feel brave. He felt a profound, soul-deep sadness for the life that was being stolen from him, for the woman who would now arrive to find only a grave. But beneath the sadness, there was a hard, cold core of resolve. He would not run. He would not cower. He would meet this army on his feet. He would show them that this small patch of land, this and his hope, was not just empty prairie. It was a home, and it was defended. He walked back to the porch, the heavy rifle in his hand. The army of warriors had stopped. They were about 200 yards out, a silent, menacing wall of humanity that stretched from one end of his small valley to the other. They were waiting, watching him, their leaders at the forefront, their war bonnets a stark, beautiful, and terrifying sight against the morning sky. Elias Thorne stood on the porch of the home he had built for his love, a lone, defiant figure facing down his own apocalypse. He was not a rancher preparing for a wedding. He was a man preparing for a war he could not possibly win, a war for the soul of his dream. The sun was fully up now, its light glinting off the barrel of his rifle. He chambered around, the sound a sharp, metallic click that was his only answer to the silent, waiting army. The stillness of his dream was over. The battle for its memory was about to begin. The silence on the prairie was a physical entity, a taut, vibrating string stretched between Elias on his porch and the silent army of warriors. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the vast, open stage, turning the scene into a tableau of stark, mythic simplicity, one man, one cabin, and the inexorable judgment of the horizon. Elias did not raise the rifle to his shoulder. To do so would be an act of aggression, a challenge. He knew the intricate and spoken etiquette of frontier warfare. He was not the aggressor here. He was the defender. He simply held the rifle at his side, its butt resting on the wooden planks of the porch. His stance was not one of defiance, but of presence. I am here. This is my place. It was a statement made in the universal language of posture and steel. The warriors waited. They were not a disorganized rabble. They were a disciplined force, and they were observing him, reading him, taking the measure of the lone man who had chosen to stand his ground. At the forefront of the host, a small group of leaders, perhaps a dozen chiefs and war leaders, sat on their painted ponies, their feathered war bonnets a splash of vibrant, deadly color against the muted tones of the prairie. One figure detached himself from this group and rode slowly forward. He was a man of immense presence, his bare chest adorned with a breastplate of polished bone and beads, his face a mask of stern, implacable authority. A magnificent full bonnet of eagle feathers trailed down his back, a sign of his paramount status. This was not a mere war chief. This was a man who commanded the respect of many nations. As he drew closer, Elias recognized him. It was Tashunka, Crazy Horse, the enigmatic and revered war leader of the Oglala Lakota. A man whose name was already a legend whispered with fear and around the campfires of the army and the settlements. Crazy Horse rode to within 100 yards of the cabin and stopped. He did not speak. He simply sat on his pony, his gaze fixed on Elias. It was a test, a battle of wills being fought in the charged silence. He was offering Elias one last chance to flee, to show fear, to abandon his claim without bloodshed. Elias met the chief's gaze and did not flinch. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, I will not run." Crazy Horse held his gaze for a long moment more, then turned his pony and rode back to his leaders. A brief, animated discussion took place. Then, the decision was made. A chief to the right of Crazy Horse raised his lance high in the air and let out a single, piercing, ululating cry that sliced through the silence. It was the signal. The battle was to begin. But it did not begin with a full-scale charge. That was not their way. It began as a test, probing of his defenses. About 50 warriors on the far right flank of the army broke from the main body. They were young, agile fighters, armed with bows and a few scattered rifles. They began to advance, not in a straight line, but in a fluid, weaving pattern, using the subtle dips and rises of the prairie for cover. A tactic designed to draw his fire and reveal his capabilities. Elias's mind was a block of ice. The sadness and the sentiment were gone, replaced by a cold, deadly focus. He knew what this was. They wanted him to waste his ammunition, to panic and fire wildly into the advancing wave. He would not give them the satisfaction. He raised the Sharp's rifle. It was a weapon of immense power and precision, a buffalo gun that could kill at over 1,000 yards. In his hands, it was less a gun and more a surgeon's scalpel. He did not aim for the main group of attackers. He picked a single, specific target, a warrior who was carrying an old, valuable Henry repeating rifle, a man who represented the greatest threat. The warrior was using a shallow depression for cover, darting from one side to the other. Elias did not fire at the man. He waited. He breathed. He became one with the rifle. He calculated the man's rhythm, the cadence of his movement. He aimed not at where the man was, but at where he was going to be. He squeezed the trigger. The Sharps roared, the sound a deep, resonant boom that was utterly dwarfed by the vastness of the prairie, yet it was a sound of absolute authority. The single, heavy-caliber bullet crossed the 200 yards in an instant. The warrior with the Henry rifle, in the middle of a dash, suddenly collapsed, his legs folding under him as the bullet, aimed with inhuman precision, shattered his hip. He did not die, but his scream of agony was a clear, terrible message to the others. The lone man in the cabin was not just a farmer. He was a marksman of the highest order. The advancing warriors immediately dropped to the ground, their fluid, confident attack broken. They began to return fire, their arrows arcing high in the air, thudding into the log walls of the cabin, their rifle shots whizzing wide of the mark. Elias had already retreated from the porch into the main room of the cabin, using a small, carefully prepared loophole he had cut between two logs. He was no longer a visible target. He was a ghost, a deadly, and seen presence. He reloaded the heavy, single-shot rifle, his movements economical and sure. He had made his first statement. I am not a victim. I am a hunter. Every shot I fire will have a purpose. Every bullet will claim a price. He watched the warriors on the field. They were more cautious now, moving in short, crawling bursts, their initial bravado replaced by a grim, professional respect. They were testing him, and he was teaching them a harsh and bloody lesson in the language of his rifle. This was not a battle for victory. Elias knew he was already a dead man. This was a battle for his honor. It was a meticulously crafted, deadly piece of theater, performed for an audience of 500 warriors. He was a lone actor on a stage of prairie grass, and he was determined that his final act would be a masterpiece of courage and defiance. A story that would be told in the winter counts of the Lakota and the Cheyenne for generations to come. He was no longer fighting for Anna's hope. He was fighting to become a part of its legend. The battle for Anna's hope settled into a grim, deadly rhythm. It was a siege in miniature, a slow, methodical chess match played with bullets and arrows across a board of sun-scorched grass. The 50 warriors on the field had learned their lesson. They no longer advanced with reckless courage. They moved with the painstaking slowness of snakes, crawling on their bellies through the grass, using every fold in the land for cover. Their goal was to inch their way into effective rifle range, to surround the cabin and overwhelm its lone defender with a concentrated volley of fire. Inside the cabin, Elias was a master of his small, wooden fortress. He had transformed the home he had built for love into an efficient instrument of war. He had two loopholes on each wall, giving him a full 360-degree field of fire. He moved between them constantly, never giving the enemy a predictable target. He was a phantom, his presence felt only through the deafening report of the Sharps and the terrible, final consequence of its single, massive bullet. He did not fire often. Ammunition was more precious to him than gold, more valuable than the minutes he had left to live. Each shot was a carefully considered, deliberate act. He did not waste his bullets on the warriors who were far out, firing wildly. He waited. He watched. He chose his targets with a surgeon's cold precision. He targeted the leaders, the men who were trying to direct the others. He targeted the men with the best weapons. He made every bullet a tactical decision, designed not just to kill, but to disrupt, to disorganize, to sow fear. A warrior armed with a bow rose to one knee to get a clearer shot. Before he could draw his string, the sharps roared, and the man was thrown backwards, a neat, dark hole in his chest. A small group of 3 men, thinking themselves safe behind a small rise, began to coordinate a charge. Elias's bullet struck the rock just in front of them, showering them with stone splinters, and they scattered, their charge broken before it could even begin. He was not just fighting them, he was teaching them. He was demonstrating the awesome, terrible power of a single, determined man, armed with a superior weapon and an unshakable resolve. He was a fortress of will, and the price of assaulting his walls was being paid in blood. But the warriors were learning too. They were the finest light cavalry and skirmishers in the world, and they adapted. They stopped moving in groups, spreading out, making it harder for him to choose a single, valuable target. They began to use the terrain with an almost supernatural skill, appearing and disappearing in the tall grass like spirits. The arrows began to fall with greater accuracy, thudding into the log walls around his loopholes with a menacing, percussive rhythm. A few lucky rifle shots from their side began to splinter the wood near his face. The sun climbed to its zenith, turning the inside of the cabin into a stifling, smoke-filled oven. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Sweat poured down Elias's face, stinging his eyes. His shoulder ached from the brutal recoil of the heavy rifle. His ears rang with the constant, concussive boom. He was a machine, his body a simple extension of the gun, his mind focused on the deadly geometry of the battlefield. The man who had hummed happily that morning, who had dreamed of a schoolteacher from St. Louis, was a distant, faded memory. He knew he could not last forever. His small pile of brass cartridges was dwindling with an alarming speed. And the main body of the army, the 450 warriors who had been watching the battle with a stoic, silent patience, would not remain spectators forever. This initial assault was a test, but if the test was not concluded soon, the full, overwhelming weight of the war party would be brought to bear. His greatest enemy was not the warriors outside, but the thirst that was beginning to parch his throat and the exhaustion that was beginning to weigh on his limbs. He took a moment, during a lull in the fighting, to crawl to the water bucket in the corner. He took a long, deep drink, the cool water a momentary, blessed relief. As he drank, his eyes fell upon Anna's photograph on the mantel. Her kind, smiling face looked out at the scene of violence and death, a silent, heartbreaking witness. He felt a pang of profound sorrow, a ghost of the man he had been that morning. He was not just defending a piece of land. He was defending the memory of a future that would now never be. He was paying the price for his dream, and the price was being tallied, bullet by bullet. He finished drinking and crawled back to his post. A new wave of warriors was beginning to advance, moving with a renewed determination. His brief respite was over. He reloaded the sharps, the heavy cartridge sliding into the breech with a familiar, heavy click. He settled the stock against his aching shoulder, took aim at the new threat, and prepared to sell his last, few precious moments of life at the highest possible price. The afternoon wore on, a long, brutal story written in gunpowder and blood. Elias had lost count of his shots, of the men who had fallen to his rifle. He knew only that his small pile of brass cartridges had dwindled to a terrifyingly small handful, and the barrel of the sharps was so hot it was painful to touch. He had fought his war. He had made his statement. But the end was now, inevitably, close. The warriors on the field had finally succeeded in crawling to within effective range. A constant, withering fire now rained down on the cabin. Bullets ripped through the log walls, sending splinters of wood flying through the smoke-filled air. Arrows, their tips wrapped in burning, pitch-soaked rags, began to thud into the roof, and the dry timber began to smolder, small tendrils of smoke curling up towards the sky. The cabin was becoming his funeral pyre. He knew he had only minutes left before the fire took hold or a lucky bullet found its mark. He fired his last few shots from the sharps, then tossed the now useless rifle aside. He drew his Colt Peacemaker, its 6 rounds a pathetic, final defense. This was it. The moment of the final charge. He waited, his back against the wall, his pistol raised, the smell of his own burning home filling his nostrils. But the charge did not come. Instead, a new sound cut through the chaos of the battle. A single, clear, high-pitched voice, calling out in English. "Man of the lonely house, cease your fire. The chiefs would speak with you." Elias froze, his finger tight on the trigger of his Colt. It was a trick. It had to be. A ploy to get him to expose himself. "Lay down your weapon and show yourself," the voice called again. "You have the word of Crazy Horse. You will not be harmed." The name gave him pause. The word of Crazy Horse was not given lightly. Among the tribes, his honor was as legendary as his bravery. But to trust that word was an act of insane, desperate faith. He peered cautiously through a loophole. The warriors on the field had pulled back, out of range, their guns silent. The main body of the army was still in place, a silent, watching wall. And riding slowly forward from their ranks, holding a long staff adorned with a single, white eagle feather sign of truce, was a lone figure. It was not a warrior. It was a woman. She was young, dressed in a simple but elegant deerskin dress, her black hair into long braids. She rode with a natural, easy grace, her face a mask of serene, stoic calm. She stopped her horse in the middle of the battlefield, a solitary figure of peace in a landscape of death. Elias was stunned. This was a violation of every rule of frontier warfare he had ever known. Women were not emissaries. They were not brought to a battlefield. What was happening? His tactical mind warred with his exhausted, desperate hope. It could still be a trick, a way to lure him into a sniper's sights. But the risk of staying in the burning, collapsing cabin was now greater than the risk of accepting the parley. His fight was over, one way or another. With a final, weary sigh, he made his choice. He uncocked his pistol and laid it on the table. He took a deep breath, the smoke stinging his lungs, and pushed open the cabin door, stepping out onto the porch and into the blinding, late afternoon sun. He stood there, blinking, a solitary, smoke-stained, and blood-spattered figure. His hands were empty and held open at his sides, a universal gesture of peace. The entire world seemed to fall silent. 500 pairs of eyes were fixed on him. The woman on the horse watched him for a long moment, then dismounted. She began to walk towards him, her steps measured and deliberate. Elias's hand twitched, instinctively wanting to reach for the pistol he had left inside. But he stood his ground. He had come this far on faith. He would see it through. She stopped about 10 feet from his porch. He could see her face clearly now. She was beautiful, with a quiet, powerful dignity that was mesmerizing. But it was her eyes that held him. They were dark and intelligent, and they held a profound, sorrowful wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "I'm called Wanacha," she said, her voice the same clear, strong one he had heard from the field. "It means flower. I speak for the Council of Chiefs." "I am Elias Thorne," he replied, his own voice a raw and used croak. "What does the council want of me?" "They want to know who you are," she said, her gaze direct and unflinching. "They want to know why a single white man would choose to make war against the combined strength of the Lakota and Cheyenne nations. They have never seen such a thing. They do not know if you are the bravest of men or the most foolish." "I did not choose this war," Elias said, his voice gaining strength. "The war came to me. This is my land, my home. A man has a right to defend his home." "This is not your land," Wanacha countered, her voice firm but not unkind. "This is the land of the people, the land of the buffalo. You Vehoe. You come and you scar it with your fences and your square houses. You kill the buffalo. You drive away the game. You are a poison on the land." "I have killed no buffalo," Elias said. "I have built no fences beyond what I need for my own animals. I have taken only what I need to live. I have honored this land." "You are one man," she acknowledged. "But you are the point of the spear. Behind you, 1,000 more will come, then 10,000, until the land is broken and the people are gone. This is why the chiefs have gathered. This is why we ride. We are not making war on you, Elias Thorne. We are making war on the future you represent. We are here to say, no more." Her words were a revelation, a sudden, blinding flash of understanding. He had seen this not as a battle, but as a personal attack. He had been so focused on his own small dream, his own small patch of land, that he had been blind to the larger, epic tragedy that was unfolding around him. He was not just a man defending his home. He was a symbol. He was the unwitting, solitary vanguard of an invasion. "The men you have killed today," Wanacha continued, her eyes sweeping over the still forms that dotted the prairie. They were sons, brothers, husbands. They had names. They had families. You have brought much grief to our lodges this day. They came to kill me, Elias said, a hard edge returning to his voice. They came to burn my home. I did not fire the first shot. No, she agreed. You did not. But you have shown us what kind of man you are. You are a warrior. You fight with skill and with honor. You do not waste your shots. You do not kill for sport. This is why the chiefs are curious. This is why you are still alive. She paused, her gaze intense. The council has made a decision. They will grant you your life. They see no honor in killing one brave man when their war is with the nation of liars and thieves who sent him. But you cannot stay. This house, this ends hope. It cannot remain. It is a symbol of the world we are fighting. They will burn it, and you will leave this land and never return. It was a staggering, impossible offer. They were offering him his life, but the price was the complete and utter destruction of his dream. He looked at his cabin, the flames now beginning to lick at the edges of the roof. He looked at Anna's photograph, which he could just see through the open doorway, her smile about to be consumed by the fire. He looked at the vast, beautiful, and terrible land that he had come to love. To accept was to live. To refuse was to die, and to have it all be for nothing. The choice was brutal, but it was not a choice at all. And if I refuse, he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Then the truce is over, Wanacha said simply. And the 500 warriors who are waiting will show you how the people mourn their dead. The silence that followed Wanacha's ultimatum was absolute. Elias stood on the porch of his dying dream, the smoke from his burning roof stinging his eyes, the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on him. His mind, the cold, tactical instrument that had kept him alive all day, was silent. This was not a tactical decision. It was a choice of the soul. He had stood his ground. He had fought his war. He had proven his point, whatever that point had been. To die now, to force the final, bloody conclusion, would be an act of pure, pointless pride. It would not save his home. It would not bring Anna back to a life that no longer existed. It would only add his own body to the pyre. And Anna, what would she think? She was a woman of books, of reason, of kindness. She would not want his death to be a final, stubborn footnote in a battle he had already lost. She would want him to live, to take the memory of what they had almost had and carry it forward. He looked at Wanacha, at her calm, wise, and sorrowful eyes. In them, he did not see an enemy. He saw another human being, caught in the same brutal, inexorable gears of history as he was. She was not a savage. She was an emissary of a people fighting for their own homes, for their own future. In a different world, under a different sky, they might have been friends. I accept, Elias said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. His voice was hoarse, defeated. It was the sound of a man surrendering not just a battle, but a universe of hope. Wanacha gave a slow, solemn nod. She turned and walked back towards her horse, her duty as an emissary fulfilled. She had offered the terms. They had been accepted. As she mounted, a group of 20 warriors, who had been waiting, detached themselves from the main body of the army. They were carrying torches. They began to advance towards the cabin, their faces grim, their movements deliberate. They were not a war party now, they were an execution squad, and their task was to erase his dream from the face of the earth. Elias did not move. He stood on his porch and watched them come. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him run. He would bear witness to the end. But before they reached the cabin, he turned and walked back inside, into the smoke-filled room. The heat was intense, the air thick and hard to breathe. He walked to the mantel, past the table he had so carefully polished, past the curtains he had so proudly hung. He reached through the smoke and took Anna's photograph. He tucked it carefully inside his shirt, the small, hard square of the frame, a final, tangible piece of the life he was leaving behind. He took one last look around the room, at the home he had built from his hope, and then walked back out onto the porch, just as the warriors arrived. They did not look at him. Their faces were impassive, their eyes focused on their task. They methodically, efficiently, threw their torches through the windows and the open door. The dry pine logs, already heated by the smoldering roof, caught almost instantly. With a deep, Whooshing roar, the cabin erupted in flames. The heat was a physical blow, driving Elias back from the porch. He stumbled into the yard, his face blackened with soot, his heart a cold, dead cinder in his chest. He stood and watched it burn. He watched the cornflower blue curtains vaporize into black ash. He watched the smooth, polished table blacken and collapse. He watched the roof fall in, sending a shower of brilliant, terrible orange sparks into the darkening sky. He watched his home, his sanctuary, his entire future turn into a roaring, funeral pyre. The entire army of 500 warriors watched with him, a silent, grim audience to the destruction. They were not gloating. There was no sense of triumph. There was only a profound, somber sense of finality. This was the price of their land. This was the consequence of the white man's dream. When there was nothing left but a roaring, skeletal frame of fire, Crazy Horse and the other chiefs rode forward. They stopped before Elias, their painted ponies snorting nervously at the heat and the smell of smoke. "You are a brave man, Elias Thorne," Crazy Horse said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, the words spoken in his own Lakota tongue, translated by Wanacha, who had ridden up beside him. "You have a strong heart. You fight like a wolf defending its den. The people will remember what you did here today. Your name will be spoken in our lodges." It was the highest honor a warrior could receive from his enemy. But the words were ashes in Elias's mouth. "My horse is in the barn," Elias said, his voice a dead, emotionless monotone. "I will take it, and my saddle, and I will go." Crazy Horse nodded. Elias walked to the barn, the heat of the fire on his back. He saddled Shadow, his movements stiff, mechanical. He led the horse out into the yard. He did not look back at the inferno that had been his home. There was nothing left to see. He mounted his horse. He was a drifter once more, a solitary man with nothing but a horse, a gun, and a ghost in his pocket. He turned Shadow west, towards Deadwood, towards the woman who was arriving tomorrow to marry a man who no longer existed, to live in a home that was now a pile of smoking ash. As he rode away, a single rider detached herself from the main body of the army and fell into place behind him, following at a respectful distance. It was Wanacha. "The chiefs have asked me to escort you," she called out to him, "to ensure that you are not harmed by any overzealous young warriors, and to ensure that you do not turn back." Elias did not answer. He just rode on, his back straight, his gaze fixed on the western horizon. He was a man hollowed out, a walking shell of grief and loss. He had faced an army and survived, but he had lost everything. He had won his life, but he had lost the reason for living it. The silence of the prairie returned, but it was no longer a silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The ride to Deadwood was a journey through a personal hell. Every mile that took Elias further from the smoking ruins of his ranch was another step away from the man he had been, from the future he had so carefully constructed. He rode in a state of numb, silent shock, the world around him a meaningless, gray blur. The bright, hopeful prairie had been transformed into a landscape of ash and ghosts. Wanacha rode behind him, a silent, constant presence. She did not try to speak to him, did not offer any words of comfort or explanation. She was a woman who understood the sacredness of grief, and she allowed him the dignity of his silence. She was his honor guard, his jailer, and his sole, strange companion in his desolation. They arrived in Deadwood on the afternoon of the 15th, just as the sun was beginning its descent behind the jagged, pine-covered hills that surrounded the notoriously rough mining town. Deadwood was the antithesis of the quiet solitude Elias had cherished. It was a chaotic, muddy, sprawling camp, a place of raw, unbridled greed and desperate ambition. The air was thick with the smell of pine sawdust, cheap whiskey, and unwashed humanity. The sounds were a constant cacophony, the clang of blacksmiths' hammers, the tinny, out-of-tune music from a dozen saloons, the shouts of mule skinners, and the low, constant rumble of thousands of voices all talking, yelling, and bargaining at once. To Elias, it was a vision of the very world he had tried to escape, the world that the warriors on the prairie were fighting against. It was loud, ugly, and suffocating. He rode down the main street, a ghost at his own funeral. Men he knew, other ranchers and prospectors, called out greetings to him, their faces full of cheerful ignorance. "Elias, you come to town for a celebration," one shouted, referring to his well-known wedding plans. Elias could only nod, his face a grim, stony mask. He and Wanacha drew more than a few stairs. Alone, soot-stained rancher being trailed by a young, beautiful, and armed Indian woman was not a common sight, even in a place as strange as Deadwood. But the town had a short attention span, and its inhabitants were too consumed by their own pursuits to pay them much mind. They stopped in front of the livery stable. It was here that he was supposed to meet the stagecoach. It was here that his new life was supposed to have begun. He dismounted, his body stiff and aching, not just from the ride, but from the soul-deep weariness of his loss. "This is where I leave you, Elias Thorne," Wanacha said from her horse, her voice soft. "My duty is done." He turned to face her. In the chaotic, dirty street of this white man's town, she seemed like a being from another world, a figure of serene, quiet dignity. He owed her his life. He felt a strange, profound connection to this woman who was both his enemy and his savior. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Live well," she replied, her dark eyes holding his for a long moment. "And do not forget what the land has taught you." With a final, solemn nod, she turned her pony and, without a backward glance, rode out of town, a solitary, graceful figure disappearing back into the wild, silent world to which she belonged. Elias was now truly alone. He stood in the muddy street, the noise and the chaos of Deadwood swirling around him, a man adrift in a sea of strangers. He looked up the street towards the stagecoach office. A small crowd was gathering. The stage was due to arrive at any moment. A part of him wanted to run, to get on his horse and ride away, to disappear back into the wilderness and never speak to another human being again. How could he face her? How could he look into her hopeful, smiling face and tell her that their dream was a pile of ashes? How could he explain the war he had fought, the men he had killed, the home that was gone? The thought of causing her that pain was a new, sharper kind of agony, a pain that made the battle itself seem like a distant, impersonal thing. But he did not run. He had made his stand on the prairie. He would make his stand here. He owed her the truth. He owed her that, at least. He walked with heavy, leaden steps towards the stagecoach office, a man walking towards his own execution. The crowd grew thicker as the rumble of the approaching stage became a reality. He found a spot by the wall of the assayer's office, pulling the brim of his hat low, trying to become invisible. The stagecoach, a magnificent, mud-spattered Concorde, thundered into town, pulled by a team of 6 lathered horses. It came to a dramatic, creaking halt in front of the office, and the driver, a grizzled man with a face like a road map of the frontier, called out the destination with a weary pride. The door opened, and the passengers began to emerge, stiff and dusty from their long journey. A fat, sweating drummer in a fancy suit, a hard-eyed gambler with a slick-back mustache, a young soldier, his uniform crisp and new. And then, her. She stepped down from the coach, and the entire, loud, chaotic world of Deadwood seemed to fall away. She was exactly as she had been in her photograph, and yet so much more. The picture had not captured the intelligence and life in her eyes, the gentle, determined set of her mouth, the quiet grace of her movements. She was a splash of calm, civilized beauty in this rough and civilized place. She stood for a moment, looking around at the crowd, a slight, nervous apprehension on her face, searching for the man she had come so far to meet. Elias's heart, which he had thought to be a dead, cold thing, gave a single, painful lurch. All the words he had prepared, all the explanations, all the apologies, turned to dust in his mouth. He was a fraud, a failure. He was a man covered in the soot of his own destroyed dream. How could he possibly approach this woman, this beacon of hope and life, and drag her into the darkness of his own ruin? He couldn't do it. He took a step back, melting into the shadows of the alleyway beside the office, his hat pulled so low it covered his eyes. He would let her wait. He would let her think he had not come. It was a coward's choice, but it felt like a final, necessary act of mercy. She would be angry, she would be heartbroken, but she would be free. She would eventually take another stagecoach and go back to her world of books and reason, and she would forget the grim, failed rancher who had promised her a home he could not protect. He stood in the shadows, his heart breaking, and watched as Anna Mayhew, the woman he loved, the woman he had lost before he had even found her, stood alone in the swirling dust of Deadwood. her hopeful expression slowly turning to one of confused, anxious disappointment. It was the cruelest, most necessary act of his life. Anna waited. The crowd around the stagecoach office thinned, the other passengers collected by friends or family, or disappearing into the maw of the nearest saloon. The driver and his shotgun guard unloaded the luggage, great, heavy trunks and small, personal carpet bags, and piled them on the boardwalk. Soon, only Anna and her two modest trunks were left, a small, solitary island of hopeful stillness in the chaotic current of Deadwood's main street. From his hiding place in the shadows of the alley, Elias watched, every moment an exercise in self-inflicted torture. He saw the way her initial, hopeful searching of the crowd had turned to a quiet, dignified patience. He saw the way she smoothed the wrinkles from her traveling dress, a small, nervous gesture. He saw the way her gaze kept returning to the faces of the strange, rough men who passed by, a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. He was her anchor in this strange, intimidating world, and he had failed to appear. He was a coward. The thought was a bitter, burning coal in his gut. The sun began to dip below the pine-clad hills, and the streetlights' current lamps on tall posts were being lit, casting long, dancing shadows. The noise of the town did not diminish, it simply changed its tune, the workaday sounds of hammers and saws replaced by the raucous sounds of fiddles, tiny pianos, and drunken laughter. Deadwood was coming alive for the night, and Anna was still alone, a stark, vulnerable figure in the growing darkness. He couldn't just leave her there. His sense of honor, the last, tattered remnant of the man he had tried to be, would not allow it. He had to do something. He couldn't face her, not yet, but he couldn't abandon her either. He slipped out of the back of the alley and made his way through the maze of back streets and refused piles to the town's only respectable hotel, the Grand Central. He approached the front desk, a grand, polished mahogany affair presided over by a clerk with a slick-back hair and a condescending sneer. "I need a room," Elias said, his voice a low, rough growl. He placed a few silver dollars on the counter, coins that felt like they belonged to another man, from another life. "For a lady, a schoolteacher, just arrived on the stage. Her name is Anna Mayhew." The clerk looked at Elias's soot-stained clothes, his grim and shaven face, and the raw, haunted look in his eyes, and his sneer deepened. "A room for a lady?" he asked, his tone dripping with insinuation. Elias leaned forward, his hands flat on the counter. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a threat. He simply met the clerk's gaze, and the clerk saw in Elias's pale, dead eyes a capacity for violence so profound and absolute that the sneer melted from his face, replaced by a look of pale, sweating fear. "Yes," Elias said, his voice a quiet, dangerous whisper. "A room. The best you have. And you will send a boy to the stagecoach office to fetch her and her luggage. And you will treat her with the utmost respect, as if she were the Queen of England. Am I understood?" "Yes, sir," the clerk squeaked, his hand trembling as he pushed a key across the counter. "Perfectly, sir." Elias took the key and left, melting back into the anonymous chaos of the street. He had done what he could. She would have a safe, clean place to spend the night. It was a small, inadequate gesture, but it was all he could offer. He found himself, without conscious thought, in a dark, noisy, smoke-filled saloon at the far end of town, a place called the Devil's Own. It was a haven for the lost and the damned, a place where a man could drown his ghosts in cheap whiskey. He took a bottle and a glass to a small, secluded table in the back corner, a place where he could watch the door, a habit he couldn't break. He poured a glass of the raw, burning liquid and drank it down in one go. The whiskey did not warm him. It did not numb the pain. It only seemed to sharpen the edges of his grief, to make the image of Anna's disappointed face more vivid in his mind. He was on his third glass when a name, spoken at the bar, cut through the haze of his misery and the din of the saloon. Double quotes. "So it myself. Old Man Croft's place." The whole spread, burned to the ground. Nothing left but a smoking hole. Elias froze, the glass halfway to his lips. He strained to hear, his senses suddenly, sharply focused. The speaker was a grizzled prospector, his voice loud and full of the self-importance of a man with a fresh story to tell. "And that ain't the half of it," the man continued, to his small, captive audience. "Met one of his ranch hands on the trail, a kid named Billy. Said the place was hit by a whole damn army of Sioux and Cheyenne. But that ain't the strange part. The kids said there was a single man there, a rancher. Stood 'em all off, all day long. A regular one-man army. Took down a dozen of 'em before the chiefs themselves called a parley. A murmur of disbelief, and all went through the small crowd at the bar. What was his name? Another man asked. Don't know his name, the prospector admitted. Billy just said the Indians themselves gave him a name. Said they called him the man who fights like a ghost. Said they let him right away, right through the middle of 'em. Can you believe that? A white man, fighting off the whole damn nation, and living to tell the tale. The story was already becoming a legend, a piece of frontier mythology. Elias felt a bitter, ironic smile touch his lips. He was famous, and he was dead, all at the same time. But it was the next words that truly chilled him to the bone. Well, whoever he was, a new voice chimed in, a cold, flat voice that held a familiar, menacing edge. Mr. Croft wants his name. And he wants his head. He's offering $1,000 in gold for him. Dead or alive. Elias slowly turned his head. Standing at the bar, his back to him, was a man in a dusty duster, a known bounty hunter named Shaw. And next to him, nursing a beer, was a face from Elias's past, a man he had arrested years ago in Kansas, a hired gun named Reno. Silas Croft had not given up. He had brought the war from the prairie to the streets of Deadwood. Elias slid lower in his chair, pulling his hat down, his hand instinctively moving to the butt of his Colt. The saloon, which had been his anonymous refuge, had just become a trap. He was a hunted man again, with a price on his head. And then, his blood froze. The doors of the saloon swung open, and Anna Mayhew walked in. She stood for a moment in the doorway, her eyes blinking against the thick, choking smoke. She looked completely, utterly out of place, a wildflower in a pigsty. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of desperation and determination. She was clearly looking for someone. For him. Reno, at the bar, turned and saw her. A slow, ugly, predatory smile spread across his face. Well, well, he said to Shaw, his voice a low, greasy drawl. Look what the cat dragged in. Ain't that the pretty little schoolteacher Mr. Croft is so fond of? He detached himself from the bar and began to walk towards her. Anna, seeing the man's predatory intent, took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. Elias's choice was gone. He could not stay in the shadows. He could not protect her by staying away. His past, his present, and his stolen future were all about to collide in the smoky, violent confines of the Devil's Own saloon. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly on the rough wooden floor, and stood up. The scraping of Elias's chair was a sound that cut through the saloon's chaotic din like a gunshot. Every head in the room turned. The card game stopped. The piano player's hands froze above the keys. The loud, drunken conversations died into a sudden, tense silence. Reno, who had been advancing on Anna, stopped and turned, his hand hovering instinctively over the butt of his pistol. His greasy smile faltered as he saw who was rising from the shadows in the back of the room. A flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of pure, venomous hatred, crossed his face. Thorne, he spat, the name a curse. I heard you were dead. You heard wrong, Elias said, his voice a low, cold rumble that seemed to vibrate with a barely suppressed rage. He did not look at Reno. His eyes were fixed on Anna. Anna stared at him, her face a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, relief, confusion, hurt, and a dawning, horrified understanding. She saw the soot on his clothes, the raw, haunted look in his eyes, the gun belt strapped to his hip. This was the man from the photograph, but it was also a man who had clearly just walked through the fires of hell. Elias, she whispered, his name a fragile question in the heavy silence. Anna, he said, his voice softening for just a fraction of a second. You should not be in this place. Leave. Now. But it was too late. Reno, seeing his opportunity, moved with a sudden, vicious speed. He grabbed Anna from behind, clamping a hand over her mouth and pressing the cold, round muzzle of his pistol to her temple. Not so fast, lawman, Reno sneered, his confidence returning now that he held a shield. I think the lady is going to stay. You and I have some unfinished business. And Mr. Croft is paying a premium for both of you. Elias's face became a mask of stone. The weary, grieving man was gone, replaced by the deadly, efficient killer he had been his entire life. He had tried to bury that man. But the world would not let him rest. "Let her go, Reno," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. "This is between you and me." "I don't think so," Reno chuckled, pressing the gun harder against Anna's head. Anna whimpered, her eyes squeezed shut in terror. "She's my insurance. Now, you're going to unbuckle that gun belt and let it drop. Or the schoolteacher gets a lesson in ballistics." It was an impossible standoff. Elias was a faster gun than Reno, and they both knew it. But even he was not fast enough to draw and fire before Reno could pull the trigger on a gun that was already cocked and aimed. The saloon was frozen at a blow of imminent violence. The other patrons were either flattening themselves against the walls or diving under tables. Reno's partner, the bounty hunter Shaw, watched from the bar, a cruel, calculating smile on his face, his hand resting on his own weapon, ready to collect his share of the prize. Elias's mind raced. He had no way out. He was going to have to surrender. He was going to lose her all over again. And then, a voice, calm and clear, spoke from the saloon's entrance. "I would advise against that course of action." Every head, including Reno's, turned towards the door. Standing there, silhouetted against the streetlights, was Wanacha. She had not left. She held a loaded and cocked Winchester rifle, and it was aimed not at Reno, but at the bounty hunter Shaw. Shaw, who had been about to draw, froze, his eyes wide with surprise. "You?" Reno gasped, his attention momentarily diverted from Elias. "What the hell are you doing here?" In that split second of distraction, that infinitesimal shift in his focus, Elias moved. He did not draw his gun. He did not lunge. He simply took one long, impossibly fast step to his left. It was a move born of 100 desperate gunfights, a subtle shift of angles and firing lines. It changed the entire geometry of the standoff. For a fraction of a second, as Reno's head was turned, Elias was no longer in the direct line of fire behind Anna. He now had a clear, if narrow, shot. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand. The saloon exploded with the deafening roar of his pistol. He fired once. Reno's head snapped back, a look of pure, final surprise on his face. The gun fell from his hand, clattering harmlessly to the floor. He crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Anna, released, stumbled forward, gasping for breath, her legs giving way. Elias caught her, pulling her into his arms, shielding her with his own body. At the same time, from the doorway, Wanacha's rifle cracked. The bounty hunter Shaw, who had finally decided to make his move, was slammed back against the bar, his gun discharging into the ceiling, before he slid to the floor in a heap. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Anna's ragged, sobbing breaths as she clung to Elias. It was over. The war that had started on the prairie had ended here, in the smoke and blood of a deadwood saloon. Elias held Anna, his hand stroking her hair, murmuring her name over and over. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man, holding the living, breathing reality of his hope in his arms. He looked over her shoulder at Wanacha, who stood in the doorway, her rifle still held ready, a calm, guardian spirit who had returned from the wilderness at the moment of his greatest need. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a profound and spoken understanding passed between them. The world was not just divided into enemies and friends. It was more complicated than that. It was about honor, and about debts that had to be paid. "Come," Elias said to Anna, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Let's get you out of here." He led her out of the saloon, out of the darkness and the violence, and into the cool, clear air of the night. He did not know what the future held. His home was gone. His dream was in ashes. But he was alive. And the woman he loved, the woman he had fought a war for, was safe in his arms. He looked up at the vast, star-filled Dakota sky. His ranch, and his hope, was gone. But as he held her close, he realized that the hope had never been in the land or the cabin. It had been in her. And that was a hope that no fire, and no army, could ever destroy. Their trail was uncertain, their future unwritten, but for the first time since he had seen the shadow on the horizon, Elias Thorne felt the faint, warm, and unmistakable light of a new dawn.